I welcome you all to the 6th Street Community Synagogue, which is not the actual steward of this important event. We are merely participating in a larger, broader effort entitled Communities in Conversation, a day of worldwide learning in memory of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Of course, it's also a downtown event, and so that means it's going to have a special twist. It really all resulted from Rabbi Joe Wolfson's good idea in cooperation with the Sacks Legacy Trust. But it's a downtown event, a downtown VOD event. The Downtown VOD, an Orthodox rabbinic network established in 2013 by Rabbi Sarna and myself to advance the welfare and flourishing of the downtown Jewish community. It's joined by the Shul, obviously, but also OU, JLIC, Downtown Student Community, the Downtown Minyan, Staten Street Synagogue, Magen David of Manhattan, Hudson Yards Synagogue, and Congregation Talmud Torah Aderet El. And so we gather tonight at the start of the first Yahrtzeit of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. You are all here because you know who he was, the spiritual leader of a synagogue, then a country, and then soon a spiritual leader of the world. You knew him as a philosopher, as a legal scholar, as a best-selling author, and as one of the more compelling, certainly coherent, responsibly moral voices of our time. Undoubtedly, you're familiar with his many awards for his 38, Gabe, how many? I'm not sure what you're getting. 39 books, I think, 38, 39 books. Copious, of course you know what I'm getting at, and copious essays and commentaries, including those that are found in the Siddurim that many of you use daily. In addition to all this, he was the Ingmar and Ira Rennet Global Distinguished Professor of Judaistic Thought at New York University, which also meant that he was our neighbor. He briefly taught at Yeshiva University, but for some reason, he preferred to associate with us. I know, shocking. And he did associate with us, and for us, it was a highlight. He made it a point to visit the local synagogues, to advise our VOD, to give us that koach to really start, and he made himself available to us to help us navigate our professional and personal crises, both major and minor. The challenge for me is to tell you something that you don't know. And for that, I'll have to personalize, and I'll do so in two ways. For one, Rabbi Sacks set the standard for rabbinic homiletics, you know that, but this is in and of itself a challenge, because to read one of his Parsha or holiday essays is to be exposed to an unrivaled synthesis of clarity and sophistication. He provided us, his students, with a standard of rhetoric, one that was almost impossible to copy, unless, of course, you did copy. And that's the tidbit that you don't know. Not about Rabbi Sacks, but about a colleague of mine who one Friday ran out of time and decided to borrow one of Rabbi Sacks' Covenant and Conversation, Divrei Torah. The sermon, of course, was nuanced and relevant, but the early mention of kilometers, Parliament, and finally the Arsenal football squad were somewhat surprising to his very American congregation. This was a friend, and not me, but it was also not me. A second point that you don't know is that I met Rabbi Sacks many years before this, very early on in his chief rabbinate. I was an undergrad at Brandeis, and he came to speak. I don't want to tell you my age, but let's just say it was sometime between his works, Faith in the Future and the Politics of Hope. That timeline is only useful to Gabe Slamovitz. Anyway, Rabbi Sacks came to Brandeis University when I was an undergraduate. He spoke to all of us, but he also spoke to me in both ways. He restored my faith in the dignity of the rabbinate, that it could be balanced and intelligent, sophisticated and spiritual. And it was an important interaction for me, and probably had something to do with what I do now. He recommended to me some Byron poem and told me, and I quote, "Internalize it, commit it to memory, and you shall be enlarged." I have to be honest that I was so overwhelmed by the interaction, by his presence, and by the gorgeousness of that line that I have no memory as to which Byron poem he referenced, or if it even was Byron. But it was an important, informative moment for me. And so on his first Yahrtzeit, in the great tradition of modern rabbinic plagiarism, I urge you to continue to read him, to commit him to memory so that you may be enlarged, or perhaps more appropriately, read him, preserve his memory so that his Torah will be enlarged. Obviously, we're devastated by his passing, but comforted that even in his absence, Yagdil Torah v'yadir. To that end, you will find in the back of our synagogue 5 packets reflecting 5 topics. You're going to go somewhere around the building. I'll speak to that in a moment. You're going to go somewhere around the building and study those packets for the next 35 minutes or so. We've asked 5 downtown leaders to introduce each of the 5 topics. So we'll begin with the topic of community. Rabbi Liad Staller, Rabbi of the Stanton Street Synagogue.
I feel like a politician taking my mask off to speak. It's the most important I've ever felt. Following in Rav Gav's precedent, I can only speak from personal experience. And speaking personally, if I had to sum up in one word why I chose to be a rabbi, to pursue Jewish work, it would be because of this idea of community. And that idea has always escaped me, always been hard to put my finger on it. But one of the selections you'll see in Rabbi Sachs's booklet in the back tonight, I think gives words to an idea that I've always struggled to articulate. Because Rabbi Sachs, in just one of the selections you'll see, says that the value, the gain that we get from community is comparable to divine love, which sounds like a wild idea. Rabbi Sachs explains that the same way that what makes divine love so unique is God's ability to understand, to see, to hear every individual. Communities are able to value, to see, to hear every individual in them. I think that's an amazing idea, a goal to strive for, and something that animates a lot of our own work. But I also want to say, as someone who joined this downtown VAD, downtown community, last year, a little bit after Rabbi Sachs was with us, I think that we can see that I can personally say and see in my own experience that the reverse is true as well. Though while it's true that oftentimes the value of a community is that it can see and appropriately value an individual, when I look at the community out here gathering around the world around Rabbi Sachs's memory, and that I've met personally myself since moving here downtown, sometimes it's clear that looking at the community, looking at the events and Torah and mitzvot it inspires, one can really learn a lot about the individual who inspired them. So that's Rabbi Sachs on community.
Next, we have Rebecca Takat-Lilar, Managing Director of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life at NYU, to speak on family.
Hi, y'all. I'm going to speak about family. And we know that the importance of the family, sustaining family and building strong families was central to many of Rabbi Sachs's messages. When I would seek out his advice and wisdom on various challenges that I encountered as a Jewish leader, he would always make sure to start our conversations by asking how I was doing first, and then asking how my husband Max was doing, and then how our children were doing. That always spoke volumes to me, that was, I would rush into sort of like, here's what I'm facing now. And he would always center me and bring me back to that. One idea that we're going to look at in the sources today is that strong families create adaptive communities. And this is an idea that I've returned to numerous times over the course of the past year when faced with challenge after challenge and crisis after crisis, and leading the Bronfman Center through the pandemic. I would imagine often, what would he say to me if I could go to him and ask for his advice? And I imagine that he would tell me to get grounded by prioritizing my family first. And so that's what we'll look at today with these sources.
We call Gabe Slabovitz, community scholar and co-founder of the Downtown Minyan, to introduce Jewish identity.
There's a debate about what is a Jew: race, ethnicity, nationality, religion. And for Rabbi Sachs, it was unequivocal. The answer was we were not an ethnicity. The trouble is, he wrote, that ethnicity is where we came from, not where we're going to. Moreover, ethnicity does not last for more than 3 generations, for as long as children can remember immigrant grandparents in their distinctive ways. In the source sheets, you'll see how Rabbi Sachs talked about Jewish identity, but there are 4 larger themes in his thought that also jump out from this page. Number 1, Jewish identity is in large part mission-oriented. For Rabbi Sachs, the command to be holy meant have the courage to be different. That, he wrote, is the root meaning of kadosh in Hebrew. It means to be distinct and set apart. To be like God meant to be, God is not of the world. So we are called on to be, but not of the world. Mission-oriented, number 1. Number 2, future-oriented. For Rabbi Sachs, being Jewish was about looking toward the future. Yes, there's meaning in history, but it's what allows us to focus on the future. The future comes first. In the source sheets, you'll see the phrase a mix of faith and fate. Fate was often what happened to us. Faith is what we choose. The 2 final themes in this work you'll see are the Jewish value in education, which was the focus of his maiden speech to the House of Lords. He said, in ancient times, the Egyptians built pyramids, the Greeks built temples, the Romans built amphitheaters, Jews built schools. And because of that, alone among ancient civilizations, Judaism survived. Elsewhere, he pointed to examples of communities that built affluent and magnificent synagogues, like Alexandria in the 1st century. But he said because they didn't pull children first, they contributed little to the Jewish story. They flourished briefly and they disappeared. And finally, the final theme you'll see is the value of faith, and particularly Judaism in the larger world. How Jewish thought, Jewish identity creates Jewish thought that can respond to the problems of the secular world. And that is what it is to be a Jew. Through you, all the nations of the world shall be blessed, as God said to Abraham. Jewish identity in the thought of Rabbi Sachs.
Next, we have Annie Wachman, NYU alum, joining her NYU alum friends, 6th Street alum as well, but most importantly, Apex Director of Westchester and Riverdale. Annie will be speaking about Israel.
Rabbi Sachs' packet on Israel expresses some of Rabbi Sachs' fundamental beliefs about the centrality and the importance of the state of Israel to the Jewish experience. And yet it contains no groundbreaking ideas or facts that you probably don't already know. He starts by exploring the question of why Jews need a land, and so eloquently reminds us of the fact that without one, Judaism is but a shadow of itself. He then explores why this land, a question we have all likely pondered 7 hours into the flight to Ben Gurion Airport. Israel, a small, highly vulnerable country at the crossroads of 3 continents. It allows us as a people to never forget to always lift our eyes to the heavens. He also expresses the thought that Israel once saved the Jews, but now it is saving Judaism, providing the heartbeat of the old, new Jew and an old, new people. And as always, Rabbi Sachs weaves together with unparalleled beauty the very essence of the inkling of our souls that we don't quite have the words to express ourselves. So this source material should leave you with a taste of hope over despair, as Rabbi Sachs invites us to conclude with our own groundbreaking ideas, while inspiring us with the magic of his words and encouragement.
And finally, Rabbi Shua Mermelstein, Rabbi of Aderet El, to introduce religion and science.
Having spent some time at YU over the course of the last couple of decades, I can tell you something Gav doesn't know, which is that we actually chased Rabbi Sachs away. So you're welcome to everybody here who got to really appreciate his presence. What is especially interesting to me, though, as a proud-ish YU grad, is that One thing that Rabbi Sachs really did bring to the table and that I've grown over the course of my time to appreciate is his ability to speak directly to some of the tensions that many of our communal spaces and many of the Orthodox Jewish intellectual spaces struggle with. One of the prime tensions that I encountered when I was in college was the inability frequently for the intelligentsia, for the people who are living a life of their minds, for people who privileged study to interact with Jews around them who found Judaism meaningful in other ways, in experiential ways, in spiritual ways. Rabbi Sachs, though, had this incredible ability as a scholar, but really as a rabbi, as a gentleman, as a friend, to speak to everybody, to provide a coherence across different areas of thought that was relevant to someone, whether they were interested in science, in Torah, in religious philosophy, or whether they were interested in culture and experience and spirituality. My challenge to you all as we study Rabbi Sachs's thought on religion and science is to find and source that approachability that I found so meaningful. His ability to speak about things that might be meaningful to one or two of us in a way that made them meaningful to all of us.
Great, so it's 7:30 now. We're going to break off into chavrutas for the next 25 minutes or so. There are handouts in the back, the 5 different topics. There are 5 different handouts in the back. Take one with a partner and go study. We'll be back here at 7:55 when we'll learn from Dr. Moshe Halbertal, as well as Dr. Michal Biton and Rabbi Joe Wolfson. If you need, the Beit Midrash downstairs is open. You can move around this room as well. And there are snacks in the social hall. Enjoy. Those of you on Zoom, this is going to be very boring for you. So you can come back in a half hour, or you can just stay on and stare at my face.